Well, hi there, good evening, and welcome to the Jimbo Hannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. On the web, there we are at jimbotalk.net. Well, throughout the years, many have complained about a liberal bias to the news media. Conservative alternatives have sprung up in some places, such as the old media, talk radio, for example, and new media through internet websites and blogs. Our guest tonight says that today's liberals aren't fighting back through the marketplace of ideas. Instead, they're working to smother political discourse through media regulations, including a possible reinstitution of the Fairness Doctrine. Adam Thierer joins us to talk about his book, A Manifesto for Media Freedom, co-written with Brian Anderson, published by Encounter Books, which examines the role of free political speech throughout our nation's history, back to the early Revolutionary era firebrand pamphlets, Thomas Paine and Company, to today's explosion of new media. Mr. Thierer, good evening.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you on the program tonight. There's been a lot of discussion about the Fairness Doctrine. For the record, President-elect Obama says he is opposed to it. Of course, any number of prominent members of Congress have indicated they are in favor of it. Do you think that one side or the other will prevail in that battle?
Well, I hope that President-elect Obama is true to his word and that he does not go back on it and become a supporter of the Fairness Doctrine like many others in his party. If you go back throughout history, there were both conservative and liberal supporters of the Fairness Doctrine, but clearly today it's mostly the political left that is pushing the reinstitution of this so-called Fairness Doctrine.
The term itself, I think, is a bit of a misnomer, actually. I've never been in favor of terms which are not a lot more descriptive, frankly. For example, the fair tax. I happen to support the idea of a national sales tax. I just wish people would call it that. You say, it's a fair tax. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm willing to argue the merits, but not make up some hokey term to describe it. In this case, I think that you've got a hokey term, but it does not at all really describe what's going on here.
You've got it exactly right. In fact, in our book, A Manifesto for Media Freedom, Brian Anderson and I have a chapter on the Fairness Doctrine that we label the Unfairness Doctrine, because there really isn't anything fair about having government bureaucrats be the ones who determine what should or should not be on the airwaves. This should be something left to free media operators out there in the marketplace making on their own merits based upon what their public demands, not what government bureaucrats want.
Now, I will actually depart with you a bit there. There was a time when there was media scarcity, genuine media scarcity in this country, and when broadcasting amounted to a quasi-public utility, when something along those lines struck me as not a terrible idea. I find it principally wrong today because technology has made it outmoded.
Well, that's a fair point. That there was certainly a time before, let's say, the mid-'70s when media was far more scarce than it is today. I mean, since 1970, in fact, we've seen a doubling of the number of both radio stations and broadcast television stations in the United States. So there's no doubt about it, we have more media abundance today than ever before. That being said, the scarcity of which you speak was also partially a creation of government regulation. When the government decided to basically license off these various types of broadcast properties, instead of allowing them to become private property freely traded in the marketplace, that created some inherent limitations to the sheer number of spectrum licenses and the sort of innovation that could have taken place, and that ended up being the justification for additional regulations like the Fairness Doctrine.
Although, let's face it, I mean, if you were not going to have utter chaos on the airwaves, and a lot of people forget that in the 20s, before the Federal Communications Commission, or I guess it was the Radio Commission, whatever they called it,
right,
first came into being, you had utter chaos. Oh, I got a transmitter, I'll pick me a frequency here, I'll just throw darts at a board, pick a frequency, I'll broadcast with whatever power I want, and the radio waves had become just a mishmash of interference and static. Now, as long as you're going to have a fairly limited band set aside for this, this, and even back then you still had other things. You had police calls and ship to shore and stuff like that. So if you're going to decide that in fact radio is going to be confined to the 540 to 1600 kilohertz band, and also of course later FM 88 to 108, as soon as you have sufficient numbers of applications, and today, of course, there are 13,000 radio stations in this country, automatically there was going to be a certain scarcity. People were going to bump against the ceiling, and I don't know that even if you had taken away the whole licensing project and simply said first come, first served, but we're not going to allow interference, then you still would have had some level of scarcity.
Absolutely. There was no way you could defy the laws of physics back in the 20s and 30s and create a lot more radio stations than could have existed in that band that was allocated for radio broadcasting. That being said, there were certain limitations placed on the band itself and how the government then regulated the allocation of those frequencies. We never gave property rights or markets a real chance to allocate frequencies. But, you know, Jim, we need not argue about the past because, of course, we live in a different era now. And
it's a prologue only.
Yeah, exactly.
Today,
right.
There's no question.
Right. And so we are blessed to live now in an age of media abundance. In fact, you know, for the vast majority of human civilization, we humans have lived in a state of what you might regard as information poverty. And now we live in a world of information riches, and so we need not argue about the way things were. We need to think about the way things are and whether or not we want the government regulating going forward.
There is a statistic which is true, by the way, that I think there may be a comparable statistic. The statistic is that 90% of all the scientists who ever lived are alive today, which is true. We think back of all the years we've had scientists, but of course back when Copernicus and Isaac Newton were around, you know, you could count the number of scientists in the world on a couple of hands. Right. Today, I would suspect it might also be true that the amount of information generated in 2008 probably surpassed all of the information generated, let's say, for example, in the entire 19th century.
Absolutely. In fact, we have some quotations in the book from various media historians who talk about how the amount of information that you're likely to receive from your Sunday New York Times is probably greater than the average human could consume in everything he read during the 19th century. And that seems crazy to us today, but only because we are so spoiled to have all of this information bombarding our senses. So much so that when we talk about the problems we have with media today, we typically bemoan the fact that we suffer from information overload. And so this idea of information scarcity, or information poverty as I refer to it, is now a thing of the past, and we now struggle with how to sort all the informational choices and diversity at our disposal.
Yeah, this show, for example, in one form or another, goes back to 1981, and I can recall a time when I could truthfully say that if I went through 3 or 4 major newspapers, the 2 major wire services, and 2 or 3 news magazines, which was homework, but a doable project, that I had in fact exhausted the available information to me. Right. Today, I don't even worry about exhausting the available information to me. If I had a staff of 10,000 and I did nothing but eat, sleep, and read, I would touch a tiny fraction of 1% of the information. So the point I wanted to get at here in the first part, I just wanted to set this up as the beginning of the discussion, because I think it goes right to the heart of this issue, and when we'll come back we'll talk about a good deal more of what is actually to be found within the pages of a manifesto for media freedom. But the point is that technology has stripped away the only remaining conceivable argument for this fairness doctrine, and I wanted that point nailed down before we moved ahead here, because I think that a lot of people may not have thought this through. In fact, I'm hoping that it turns out that any number of proponents have not necessarily thought this through. For example, I'm wondering if they have thought through the fact that a return to the fairness doctrine might force Rush or Sean onto Air America affiliates. For example, just mull that one over for a while. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626, talking with Adam Thierer, a senior fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. Their website is pff.org, Progress and Freedom Foundation. He's director of their Center for Digital Media Freedom. And this is the Jimbo Hannon Show. Get a fixed rate loan you can live with. Go to lendingtree.com today or call 1-800-555-TREE. Lending Tree. When banks compete, you win. We'll be back here at Westwood One. Welcome back to the Jimbo Hannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-506-5626. We're taking a look tonight at the Fairness Doctrine. There's been much discussed about this, and we're doing so in the company of the co-author of the book, A Manifesto for Media Freedom, Adam Thierer, our guest. He is Senior Fellow with the Progress and Freedom Foundation. And first of all, when we talk about a return to the Fairness Doctrine, we are probably talking about a return to a Fairness Doctrine, are we not? If you could take a look at what the Fairness Doctrine was when it was law, and what are some of the options being discussed today.
Well, it's really interesting because we're not really sure exactly how it would be applied to our new media environment. I mean, clearly, we know that it would apply to broadcast over-the-air radio and television operators. That's who it traditionally applied to. But there's a very legitimate and interesting question about, is that fair to apply the Fairness Doctrine only to over-the-air radio and television broadcasters in an era when they face more competition for eyes and ears than ever before? Why isn't it that we should apply this to, say, cable or satellite television, satellite radio, or the internet? Shockingly, some people are actually advocating that. And that's what really scares me here. Practically speaking, I don't even know how it would work. Who in the world would enforce it for all of those media platforms and outlets? But realistically, I'm just not quite sure the sensibility of doing it when you have all of that diversity. That defeats the purpose and nullifies the need for it.
Yeah, as for why we did it this way, that's pretty simple. The simple fact of the matter was that when we first began to realize that there was a need for some regulation, among other things for interference issues, then the media could be described, at least in terms of scarcity, as radio. And certainly the very beginnings of television and newspapers, of course, under the theory that there will always be enough trees, would not deem to be covered by such things as the Fairness Doctrine. They were not covered by things like indecency requirements and this sort of thing. So it covered radio, and it covered then television, broadcast television, what is known today as terrestrial broadcasting, transmitters and towers that stick up in the sky. But when the new technologies came along, cable TV and cable satellite and the internet, the regulators or Congress, whomever, never chose to extend the regulations. That's why you can hear bleep and bloop and whatever all over the place on cable, but not on broadcast television. And of course, if you've got cable at home and you're browsing through your local channels, and with one click of your thumb you're over onto the Playboy channel, you immediately see that this can be somewhat nonplussed for the faint of heart. But that's the reason why, because basically they didn't think of it. Well, now, Adam, they've thought of it.
Well, indeed, they have thought of it. In fact, we give an example in the book of how one famous liberal law professor, Cass Sunstein of the University of Chicago, has talked about the idea of essentially extending the Fairness Doctrine notion to the Internet through something he calls mandatory, quote-unquote, electronic sidewalks. What he means by that is the idea that on every single web page out there that has a partisan slant to it, there would be a little bar on the side or the bottom that would somehow air alternative links or broadcasts or podcasts or whatever else. So you could imagine that the NRA website would have to have anti-gun messaging running on the side, or that a pro-abortion or pro-choice group would have to have pro-lifers running on the side. Now the silliness of this is that, first of all, I don't know how this is enforceable in a regulatory sense. How many FCC bureaucrats do you need to have out there policing the net to make that work? Number two, exactly what counts as an alternative viewpoint is not a binary matter. There's not just always a black or white side of the issue. Sometimes there's many shades of gray. How many alternative viewpoints are we talking about? And number three, why do we need to do that when all of those alternative viewpoints have their own website? Just go and search for it and you can find it.
Exactly. I would say this as the discussion continues. I wish more people, in fact, sought out alternative viewpoints. There would be a lot more thinking and a lot less shouting in this country. Having said that, that is a wish that I do not believe can be fulfilled by government fiat. I just don't see how it can, and I wouldn't even profess to begin to try to do so. From a sheer numbers point of view, well, yeah, you could probably extend these various regulations to cable. Sure, I mean, there are a few hundred channels, but it's regulatable. The Internet, as you point out, I mean, if you were to convert 10% of the federal workforce, steal them from agriculture and interior, you still would not be able to do it. So even throwing away the other arguments, assuming that it is a manifestly wonderful, necessary idea, you would never, ever find the people to do it.
Right, that's right. And again, you don't really need to when everyone has their own platform. The beauty of the modern media marketplace is that every man, woman, and child has a soapbox they can stand on and preach to the world. Now, as you say, we don't always like what they have to say, and not everybody's listening. It's hard to get an audience out there in the new media marketplace. There's no doubt about that. But the fact is that law or regulation mandating some sort of fairness or balance isn't necessarily going to magically bring that about. In fact, I think it would create quite a backlash or a potential chilling effect on all that vibrant speech that's going on out there today.
Yeah. One thing that I think that has been mentioned hand in hand with the notion of political fairness that bothers me a great deal, and that is the idea that any kind of content regulation is automatically bad, and therefore simply let all the filth that Hollywood can manufacture pour into your house and right into your kid's mind. I have to draw the line at that, and I draw the line at that for two reasons. Number one, it is manifestly incorrect, and the notion that you can equate Howard Stern with a debate about medical insurance in this country is simply nonsense. It is wallowing in all kinds of self-indulgence, quite frankly. That's number one. And number two, if, in fact, we just determine that the First Amendment dictates that every household has to be open to kiddie porn, then the First Amendment will be amended out of our Constitution within a year and a half.
Well, I understand what you're saying there, Jim, and I've written another book about these issues about parental controls and online child safety, and I agree with your concerns. However, there are some legitimate First Amendment concerns there that we have to take into account. We're getting a little bit away from our core discussion here, but I understand the point you're making. I just want to say we do have to acknowledge the fact that when we allow government to regulate in some of those ways, in some of those areas, and on some of those platforms to protect supposedly for the children against indecent messages or speech or entertainment, we always run the risk of there being a slippery slope to allow or empower the government to regulate far more speech. So granted, not everything Howard Stern says is as authoritative or interesting or informative as maybe a debate about some other issue. But the fact is, we protect Howard Stern's speech because we don't want the government to be regulating those other forms of speech if we empower them to regulate Howard.
I will say this, however, just in reply to that. Unless you have an absolute way for parents to block access to such things in their homes, and unless you start providing, by law, a la carte cable channel access so that parents can decide what comes into their house in this very method, this very arena, and it's not the central subject of our discussion, to be sure, but unless you have that, then the public backlash against all forms of information, including the important stuff, not just the garbage, will be immense, and I seriously fear for the First Amendment itself. And while I may, as the law dictates, grit my teeth and defend the right of the perverse to do certain things over the airwaves, but I will never, ever, ever equate Howard Stern with Edward R. Murrow, and there is no argument that can be made.
And one need not do that in order to defend the First Amendment rights of some of the types of speech that we might find unsavory or difficult to accept. Again, I hear you, Jim. I would like to say that an empowered electorate, an empowered family, is a better standard than sort of an empowered regulator.
Okay.
And
Very
so that's
good.
what I fear.
Very good. When we come back, we'll talk about not the fairness doctrine, but localism. Who can argue with localism? Well, there's a lot to be said good for localism, but it is in a way being now used as a stealth fairness doctrine. We'll discuss that with Adam when we return right here at Westwood One.